Hey, I'm back. I'm gonna kind of keep working through what I would be doing at this point, just to give you guys kind of an idea of how to move forward when you're looking at branding your own stuff. So just to recap, I started up here with just writing my name, all caps. I wanted to get the actual letters on paper. I wanted to see what they look like, see the shapes, see how they interact with one another. So from there, with all caps side by side, I decided I wanted to see what they would look like stacked on top of one another. So my name's kind of cool in that it's 4 letters for the first name, 4 letters for the last name. But taking a look at it, W and D are 2 of the widest letters in the alphabet. So despite having the same number of letters for each name, they're not going to line up quite the way I want them to. But it is something that I could think about and tweak in the future. So along those lines, I went to this design and started seeing, well, what happens if I just have it 2 letters per line? So it's a little hard to read. It's difficult to follow what's going on. And once again, we have the problem of having big letter here, big letter here, big letter here. There's not a lot of even distribution. So from there, I moved over here to writing my name very simply in my typical handwriting. And then directly beside that, as I talked about in class, I wanted to show you the shape that my name is making. So when we look at words, we're not looking at the individual letters and sounding out the words that way. That's not how people tend to read as they, move on from initially learning how to read. So when I take a step back and look at my name when it's all lowercase, it creates this kind of shape right here. The cool thing about that shape is it gives me negative space above where I could write something. Since this is a logo for my design work, I went from here over here and decided to see what would happen if I were to kind of tease that out a little bit. So there's some of the overlay and stuff here because I have my brush set to a lower opacity. My brain likes it when it looks like pencil, and when I'm sketching with just that small brush size, it feels more like pencil and I feel more like I'm doing analog work. So at that point, I felt a little boxed in. I felt like there just wasn't a whole lot I could do. So I started moving on to kind of looking at monograms. So we have here the DLW, have here a different version where the L is a lowercase cursive L. I took that cursive idea even further and made a monogram here with the DW using that swash finial from the D to be the entrance stroke for the W, and then pulling that left arm up to help fill some of that negative space. So not a perfect solution, but that's what these sketches are for. They're for getting ideas out, even if they're quick and dirty, especially if they're quick and dirty. So you can get more than one idea out, more than 2 or 3 ideas out in one sketching session. So then I started looking at things as shapes. So that's what this circled area over here is. I started with this version where it's just the D and the W connecting up here at the top left. Then I went down and tried to add an L, but having that L share the stem with the D runs the risk of the monogram looking like LDW instead of DLW. So likely going to keep my middle initial out. So I went from there then up here and closed off the tops of my W's, so I have very specific shapes. I have this half circle for the D and then the two triangles for the W. So that is a direction that I want to explore. So instead of focusing on that option and continuing to try to refine it, I ended up drawing kind of another option based on Kylie's suggestion here. So I had the L as a capital and then the DW and the same sort of treatment with the geometric shapes. So that first L wasn't quite what she had in mind because I was trying to kind of just show what her idea was. So this one here ended up being closer because it still has the same strokes as a capital L, but it also works as a swash. It works as a visual element in and of itself. So this is kind of where we were when class ended. I had written the word geometric for the middle of one of my mind maps, calligrapher in the middle of the other, and Swiss in the middle of the other. Chose these words because the geometric is tied to that DW solution of the shapes. I chose calligrapher because of the couple of options where I'm using a more calligraphic script rather than just straight text. And then Swiss for this version here where designer is in the negative space between the D's of my first and last name. So from here, I'm going to mind map. Now, normally for other projects, I start with mind mapping first and then move into sketches. But since this is for a personal brand and not for someone else, I don't have direction for what I want to go with this. I have to choose the direction. So now that I have some of those visuals out, they're starting to bring words to mind. And those words are things that I can use when I start building out my branding strategy in general. So, because if I think about geometric, one thing that geometric things tend to be is simple. So, simple is a word that doesn't just apply to design and doesn't just apply to the logo design. Simple could be in the language that I choose when I'm writing proposals, when I'm putting together cover letters, choosing something simple and straightforward, which I would write straightforward down as a related thought. That is an adjective that applies not only to the logo that I want to create, but the brand that I want to build out from that logo. I want to make sure that the concepts that I am integrating into my visual work is going to successfully integrate with the kind of writing that I'm going to have to do in order to explain my design decisions and in order to create a consistent verbal language that matches with my visual language. So, all right, I'm going to put a little circle around shapes, and of course a triangle is a shape. Circle, rectangle. So I could continue listing shapes, but there's not going to be any other shapes that work well with my name. Well, maybe a star. So let me put that down because I can see the apex of a star working into the W here. So that could be something interesting working with shapes. So star's a nice word to have. So what else when you think about geometry? It's simple. Geometry, when we think of it visually, tends to be very clean. That's also related to simple. So another thing that I think about when I think about geometric shapes is Art Deco. Art Deco style is very heavily influenced by geometric shapes and by repeating patterns. So from Art Deco, I would pull out another thing because we want to think about patterns. So this is very much just word association and showing how these thoughts all lead back to what my main word is, what my main descriptor is. So I could do more with geometric, but I'm going to move over to calligrapher. As I said earlier, I chose calligrapher because of the script that I started incorporating in this one monogram and the one that Kylie suggested that I try. But calligraphy is something that I do professionally. I tend more towards hand lettering. A lot of times what I'll do is initially do something in calligraphy and then I will clean it up and perfect it as hand lettering. So with that being the case, that's something that I do as an artist, but it's something unique that I bring to the table as a designer as well. So that's a good adjective for me to consider. So when I think about calligraphy, fancy is certainly a word that comes to mind. Swashes are other shapes that come to mind. If you're unfamiliar, a swash is basically like a little extra decorative element of a letter. It's not actually part of the core of the letter, but it's something that you add as a bit of decoration that adds a little bit of flair to it. So swashes I have written out. What else do I think of with calligraphy? I think of elegance. And a lot of times when we think of calligraphy and we think of elegance, that translates into kind of an upper class feeling. So now in this instance, upper class is not something that I want to represent by my logo. The reason I don't want to is because that's just not who I am as a person. I like to focus on doing work for friends and doing work for nonprofits and humanist organizations and people who help make the world a better place. But I want to write that upper class thing down so that I know I have physical proof here that, hey, this is a direction that calligrapher could go, something I need to consider when I move forward. So what else do I think of when I think of calligraphy? I think of illumination. Basically, illumination is, think about those old parchments with, beautiful calligraphy. And the very first letter of the page is this huge drop cap. And it's so intricately designed. There's a lot of illustration elements with it. A lot of times there's like gold foiling added to it. That's illumination. So with illumination, that brings to mind illustration. When I think of calligraphy also, I tend to think of italic because that's one of the styles that I am most familiar with from the calligraphy classes that I've taken, and just how that style influences a lot of my hand lettering anyway. I also think of things like uncials. If you're unfamiliar with what an uncial is, it is a type of calligraphy. If you think about Lord of the Rings, how Bilbo writes, when you look at his handwriting is a modified uncial design. So I'm actually going to put Lord of the Rings there because an uncial approach to my logo could very well put people in mind of Lord of the Rings. That's something that I need to consider. So I could keep going with that as well, but I'm running out of room and I want to make sure that I get to Swiss design. So the thing with Swiss design is that it is very simple. And one thing I'm noticing as I write simple down, hey, that is also a word that I wrote down for geometric. So that might tell me something about the kind of work that I do and how I want to be perceived. So simplicity in this way tends to be kind of professionals. I'm going to write professional. There's also a very German influence to Swiss design. That's where it started. And a lot of big proponents of Swiss design today are still German. Think about Eric Spiekermann. He's I believe he's German. He's a font typeface designer. Wonderful crotchety old man. I love listening to anything he has to say. He is fantastic. Anyway, what else do we think of with Swiss? We do think of geometric shapes a lot of times with Swiss. So there we go. There's a nice tie-in. So maybe these two things are something that I can really consider as I move forward, not just with my logo, but with perhaps illustrated elements that I want to use in my business card and my resume and my website and any social media advertising that I do. So another thing with Swiss design is gridded design. Layout is very, very much an integral part of Swiss design. Another thing that I tend to think of is the 1950s and 60s. Well, more the 50s than anything. I believe Helvetica was designed in the mid to late 50s. Bauhaus is another thing. Swiss and Bauhaus are related. They are not the same. If that word doesn't evoke a style for you, doesn't evoke any imagery, it's perfectly fine. Your mind maps, the notes that you take and stuff, they are to make sense to you. There's no one right way to approach things. It just so happens that this way is what's really helpful for me. And a big part of it is because I love words. I love pulling things together and making connections. And the first edition of our textbook, Logo Design Love, was one of the first design books that I ever bought for myself after college. And I was so excited to read his chapter that we talked about in class today from pencil to PDF, because that just absolutely changed my approach to how I did logo design and has really helped me develop better ideas that I might not have come up with had I just opened a computer and started working in Illustrator, or even opened a computer and started looking through Pinterest and Dribbble and Behance. Inspiration has its place. It absolutely does. But as designers, we need to make sure we're not just relying on ideas sparked from other people. That's why with this project, I told you, don't look at inspiration while you're doing your note-taking and your sketches. You want the ideas that you have to come from your own head. And once you have a few ideas that you think are strong, then you can start looking at inspiration. You can see how other people have worked with similar approaches to typesetting or logo design or monograms or anything like that. when you start looking for inspiration in that manner, you need to make sure that what you're doing isn't something that has been done before. You want to stand out from your competition. But the thing about inspiration, once you already have an idea, is you can see different approaches that people take. And that can help like get the gears in your brain going. So you can be like, you know, my logo doesn't look anything like that, but how he's using a pattern there, that's really interesting. And I bet that I could create my own simple pattern that would really tie this together. You want to identify what is successful about the logos and the inspiration that you're finding, and come up with your own way to implement what is successful. You're not lifting a design. You're looking at something and saying, hey, that element of that design is cool, and it is something that I could incorporate into what I've already worked on. So realistically, if I were to continue doing this, I would continue doing sketches. I would continue mind mapping further out. But I already have a professional logo that I've been using for almost 10 years, and I'm pretty happy with it. Regardless, I do think this geometric shape idea is something I want to play with just for kicks and giggles. Designing for fun is a really great way to hone your skills and to teach you things that you might not have learned to do, or that you might not want to learn to do when you have to do it for the first time for an important job for a client or something like that. So this is pretty much what I'm looking for when we're going to be talking about your sketches and how we want to move forward with your branding and the focus of your portfolio. So I will make sure to upload this. I'm going to write out the requirements and everything for this segment of the process, and I'll have all of that up, and I'll email links to you all once it's done so we're all on the same page. Otherwise, hope you have a really fantastic spring break, and I will see you in a week and a half.